right, David Gura. How often have you worn camouflage?
Approximately 0 times in my life.
That surprises me 0%. All right, so a very specific type of camo that you usually see in the deep woods is now getting kind of a resurgence, and you're seeing it on runways and city streets. Camouflage is getting a surge, and it's getting licensing deals with some major brands. So here to explain what exactly this is and why it's happening is Bloomberg Pursuit's Madison Darbyshire, who has come with
Bearing
a
gifts.
show and tell,
Maybe not
I
gifts,
believe.
but...
Yeah. So when I read this and it said camo, I thought like fatigue camo, but that's not quite it. That was what we did in like the early aughts, but this is like deep woods camo?
This is deep woods camo. We call it hunting camouflage.
Okay.
And when I started reporting the story, I didn't actually know there was much of a difference. But it turns out it's an entirely different category of camo, and it's dominated by a few very large companies in the Deep South. And I didn't even know to be looking for it until I had to write a story last year about hunting that required me to buy an outfit. Bloomberg bought me this beautiful jacket so that I could do the story, and I started wearing it around New York City. You could see it's got like leaves and sticks on it. I started wearing it around New York City, and people would stop me on the street and ask me where I had got my jacket, what designer was it, and I had to tell them it was Bass Pro Shop from Harlingen, Texas, and it cost $15, but it was easily the most complimented item of clothing in my wardrobe. And I started to wonder, like, why were people so interested in the style? And then I started seeing it everywhere in New York City.
I wore the wrong one. I wore the military fatigue camo.
Yeah.
Is there a right or a wrong way to wear it? Like, can I don the Yankee hat with this is a lot of camo. Does this work?
Well, I think it works.
How do you wear camo the right way?
I think she's being very
She's
polite.
being very polite.
I think it works, but they mean very different things.
Yeah.
So that green hunting or this green camo that you have on your hat was essentially it was the only camo that until the mid 80s existed, because it was created essentially for America's last foreign war, which was Vietnam. But hunters in the American South were frustrated that the camo didn't really work with the topography of the region, and they were still finding themselves like very visible to the animals that they wanted to hunt, like turkeys. So there were two kind of major players in this. One's named Toxie Hayes, and the other is Bill Jordan. And they decided to design their own camo in kind of two separate camo empires, one called Realtree, one called Mossy Oak. In order to create hunting camo that was a little bit more appropriate for the topography of America. And that camo has not been popular in fashion until very recently. Like, this camo was a very big part of the anti-Vietnam War protest. It's something that you would see in Abercrombie and Fitch. I know that I wore it like my entire early adolescence. I wore cargo pants. But to a lot of people, this camo really suggests military. It suggests like aggression, it's very masculine, and there's something that's really interesting happening with the hunting camo is that the associations people have with this pattern tend to be very regional. So people who hunt, people who are from the South, will be very familiar with this pattern, but until the last 5 years, you really didn't see it that often in New York.
Let me ask you about that. So you here are the trendsetter going to Bass Pro Shops and coming to New York City wearing this. Trendsetter. You asked if I've ever worn it. No, but I grew up in the South, so it is recognizable to me. When and how did it make the leap to something that folks here in New York, there'd be a cognoscenti in New York who would recognize what this is?
American style, rural Southern style has kind of become a ubiquitous aesthetic for Americana right now. You see cowboy boots have had this major boom. Carhartt jackets are everywhere in Williamsburg as well as the South.
Virginia and Brooklyn.
Yeah, there's nowhere you can go where men do not want to wear a vintage Carhartt jacket, which when I was growing up, like I have a lot of family in the Deep South, that was considered workwear. My grandfather used to call it clothes for honest labor.
Interesting.
You bought them in the Tractor Supply. They were not sold on high streets of Paris the way they are now. But what people were really looking for was this kind of vintage aesthetic. So they started buying the vintage Carhartt that looked like they had been worn in, like worked in. And the kind of logical next step for that was hunting camo, because it has this very American, very rural association. But people, one of the really interesting things about this moment is people are buying used hunting clothes. So things that have been really broken in are being worn by men who have never hunted a turkey in their lives.
But that's what I was going to ask is like my issue with the Carhartt is someone else who grew up with people actually wearing these for work is like you're cosplaying a working American. It's giving like Marie Antoinette playing milkmaid. Like, is there something kind of off about these guys who've never done this, trying to emulate this, or is that just fashion and just kind of part of the fun?
I think it's both. It is fashion. People want to wear things that suggest an identity that they want to be a part of. Like denim and workwear really entered fashion in the 70s and 80s when like blue jeans were not a thing, right, before they came into fashion, because people wanted to wear things that suggested blue collar. Because it was seen as like more virile, more masculine. And you see kind of the same thing coming into play. We're in this moment where traditional masculinity is kind of politically ascendant. And so there are people who are unironically wearing these articles of clothing because that's what they think an American man looks like. And then there are people who might be wearing it like the Balenciaga jacket that kind of fashion loves irony, right? And so they want to suggest these things. And there is something a little ironic about paying $2,600 or $2,700 for a hunting jacket that you can get at Bass Pro Shops for $15, right? So it is really interesting the way that fashion takes these controversial images and they ironize them. And also to some people, like one of the things I think we don't talk about enough is there's just not that many patterns that men feel like they can wear that are culturally acceptable for men to wear that fit with traditional ideas of masculinity. They don't really have animal prints the way that women do. They don't really have florals unless they're feeling particularly bold. Maybe they have stripes. And camo is one of those things that men really gravitate towards and then women gravitate towards to steal from the men.